Welcome, my friends, to another episode of Shoot First, Ask Questions Later. Today, we are joined by Rabbi Michael Broyde, and I am so excited to have you on the podcast because as I was growing up and I was first exposed to publications like the Journal of Halacha Contemporary Society, aka the RJJ Journal. This was a name. Rabbi Michael J. Broyde was a name that I would see recurring over and over again in contemporary halachic publications. And what we're going to be talking about today, actually, is your recently published book, Jewish Law and the American Thanksgiving Celebration, which I understand to be a culmination of your very seminal Thanksgiving article in the RJJ Journal from, what is it, like 2 decades ago or 3 decades?
3 decades ago.
Three
Yeah.
decades ago, Kanai Nahara. So it's very apropos. We're recording this about a week before Thanksgiving, and we'll try to get it out very soon. And, I would be very remiss if I started listing your entire CV over here because to our listeners who have not been graced somehow with Rabbi Broyde's writings, he's very prolific, and I don't like to insult people, but one must be living under a rock if they haven't read anything from you. So which actually gets me to ask the first question. Before we get a little bit of an overview of some of the interesting findings that you've seen in your article and in your book, of course, we'll talk about Ramosha Feinstein on Thanksgiving, but hopefully we'll do a little bit more than just that. How is it that you became like the go-to, like, I don't know if anyone calls you the Thanksgiving Rebbe or the Thanksgiving Rabbi, but kind of in the literature, I don't think any article or shiur on Thanksgiving cannot quote your article.
I wrote the first article on it, and I was the first to survey um, the breadth of the halachic authorities, and I solicited 4 or 5 tshuvot that entered the literature. I solicited a letter from Rav David Cohn and from Rabbi Ephraim Greenblatt and from Rabbi Feivel Cohn and from Rabbi Henkin. And I solicited the tshuva that Rabbi Menashe Klein wrote, but he wrote it to Rabbi Ephraim Greenblatt rather than to me. But I am the shoel in the sense that Rabbi Greenblatt, I turned to Rabbi Greenblatt and said, "You want to ask Rabbi Klein?" And I wrote the letter to Rabbi Klein, who then wrote it back to Rabbi Greenblatt. Those two tshuvot interrelate.
So
It
that's
was
already
also
that's already news to me because I only knew that you wrote the major survey in the RJJ Journal. I didn't realize that you are a part of the chuvos that were then cited in the paper.
the tshuvos were written um, to me. I wrote this article at what I call a Gedolim inflection moment, which is the Rav um, had essentially stopped being a presence. Rav Moshe had passed away. Of course, Rav Hutner had passed away. And there was a new generation of Gedolim entering the scene. And I was curious to see if they were more or less American. And the
Hmm.
most interesting thing to me is that in the 90s, all of them, all of the Gedolim that wrote, quickly put themselves in the footsteps of the Gedolim before then, and nobody struck out on an independent path.
Hmm.
Like 10 years later, Rabbi Belsky at an event turned to me and said, "Did you write on Thanksgiving?" And I said, "That's me." And he said, "Let me tell you my view." And I quoted in the book. Rabbi Belsky said, "I think that a transition has occurred from Rabbi Soloveitchik's celebration of Thanksgiving as a mark of patriotism, which I, Rabbi Belsky, think is a very good idea,
Hmm.
to America nowadays, in which Thanksgiving is football and shopping, and I'm against that. So I want to stake out," Rabbi Belsky said, "a different ground, which is if this were a mark of patriotism, I would stand up and insist that we all celebrate. We are patriotic Americans." But by 1996 or 7, when Rabbi Belsky was speaking to me, it had already turned into a eat until you roll off your chair. then turn on your television set and prepare for Black Friday shopping.
Well,
And Rabbi
if
Belsky was
I
against that.
if I may interject, I mean, this is kind of symptomatic of every holiday that is in the American calendar. I mean, take even Christmas. So you ever see those bumper stickers that says "Keep the Christ in Christmas"? And I never thought about this until I was in the rabbit and I was getting frustrated about how people were misportraying Judaism to the public. That I realized just how perverted Christmas has become. And I've spoken with devout Christians who lament how it's just about Santa and Coca-Cola and gifts and snow, and meanwhile it actually has real significance to their religion. So it seems everything has become secularized and commercialized.
Yes, I agree with that. And indeed, I will note that the younger generation of eminent poskim do not continue Rabbi Soloveitchik's policy of celebrating Thanksgiving because they don't see a connection between patriotism and Thanksgiving. One of the themes of the book is that I wish to encourage the countercultural Orthodox. We are, in the end, countercultural to try our hardest to celebrate Thanksgiving patriotically.
Well, it's interesting that you say Rosalovichik encouraged it. I never met Rosalovichik. We didn't overlap. But I'm looking at Rav Herschel Schechter's writing about it in Nefesh Harav, and the way he puts it is V'chein she'ein ba chilasim b'yom Thanksgiving mishum chukas hagoyim. V'chein shamanu shahisa gam das aviv hagom Ramosha Soloveitchik. So he kind of, at least just the way it's portrayed through Rav Schechter's lens, is that Rav Soloveitchik permitted it, but it doesn't sound like, at least from what I've seen, that he championed it. Is that your impression?
As I quote in the book, Rabbi Rakefet notes that the Rav said to him, we should celebrate Thanksgiving. And the Rav not only um, permitted it, he tinkered with his shear schedule so that he could go back to Boston to
Hmm.
do so. It was
Wow.
important to the Rav, and it was even more important in the 50s and the 60s before any of the cultural changes that came to America came. If you read Rabbi Lamb's sermon from the Spanish and Portuguese shul on Thanksgiving, you see a yearning to be integrated into American life. This is clearly why people are pestering Rav Moshe to
Yes.
permit it. They're pestering Rav Moshe to permit it because they think that it's important to integrate. And celebrating Thanksgiving is part of this integration.
Very good. So we back at the beginning of this podcast, in 2023, I think is when we started it, and now we're approaching the end of 2025. I had a colleague of mine on, Dr. Yisrael Ben Porat, and we went through. He focused strictly on Rav Moshe's chuvos on the topic. And he noted something which also troubled me a little bit, though it doesn't trouble me as much now that I've looked more into Rav Moshe's attitude toward patriotism. But the way people superficially tend to describe Rav Moshe is that he was this all-American patriot. And so one might be not troubled, but maybe a little bit confused as to when one looks at his chuvos, the range of kind of opinions in the chuva ranges from celebrating Thanksgiving is forbidden to maybe it is okay and we are fine with it. We won't stop you. But he never even entertains the idea that it is commendable, that's an imperative for us to celebrate Thanksgiving. And I'll be honest, I was surprised that there wasn't any aspect of that patriotism, of the Hakar Satov that we see him express in other chuvos. And I'm curious your take on that.
Um, I think that Rav Moshe is caught between a few different moving halachic blocks,
Hmm.
one of which is a sense among poskim of a certain type that this is prohibited.
Right.
Even though Rav Moshe concludes that the prohibited group is not the normative halacha, it's sufficiently imperative to the Isha halacha that Rav Moshe was. Rav Moshe was much more an Ish HaHalacha than the person who wrote Ish HaHalacha. Um,
Ooh.
that you won't get him to say ever in any topic that it's inappropriate to be strict for review. When all's said and done, there's a substantial view in halacha that thinks there is a chukas hagoyim problem. It is true that Rav Moshe doesn't think that it's the dominant view, and thus you don't have to follow it, but he would never overwhelm a significant view of Achronim by a public policy rationale. Rabbi Soloveitchik
Hmm.
is prepared to say, since the halacha permits this, period, public policy should encourage it.
Um,
Whereas Rav Moshe would never say, since there is a dispute among the Achronim, and we paskin it as mutter, we should encourage people not to be strict for the osrim. An isha halacha wouldn't do that.
Right. And I always come back to, I think artificial insemination is one of my favorite examples of that, where he was willing to go against everyone else who was making mainly values-based arguments and then only ex post facto backing it up and substantiating with halachic argumentation. But he says, no, let's like look at the halacha and come to a conclusion based on that.
And that's why Rav Moshe in the Dibros Moshe Chuvas to Rabbi Breish doesn't say it's
Yes.
mandatory. He just says mutter. He
Hmm.
says mutter. When you say to Rav Moshe, should I? He says, you didn't hear you should from me. I said it's mutter.
Well, he walks it back even a little bit as well, but not to get too into the weeds because we're not talking artificial insemination today.
But thus I think that the Rav, because he understood his role as not just being an Isha halacha, but being the prototype of how a halachic person conducts themselves in America. He's
Right.
an integrationist. He thinks the fact
Absolutely.
that this is mutter encourages this level of integration, so we should be good Americans.
100%. I mean, Ramosha and Soloveitchik, I mean, take something like the interfaith dialogue debate, what was it, in the 60s? Once you had the Second Vatican Council. So Ramosha was unequivocally opposed to any of the interfaith dialogue with the Christians, and Soloveitchik had a more nuanced approach toward it. So yeah, it's not surprising that they would differ on this. But you know what I'm curious about? So what you got to before was Rav Moshe's main argument, and I assume many make this argument, against observing, you could be medaic in the lashon, observing Thanksgiving or practicing it or acknowledging it, is because we're not supposed to imitate the ways of the non-Jews, pagans. Okay, another footnote over there. But what I'm curious to get your take on is, in one of the chuvos, he actually invokes the principle of Baal Tosif, that the Ramban understands that we're not supposed to create new holidays. So as I was sitting down in my shul here, Sons of Israel in Allentown, one of our members, Marcia Schechter, turns to me and she says, wait a minute. So how are we allowed to practice Yom HaAtzmaut? How are we allowed to have Israeli Independence Day as a holiday on our calendar? And I'm curious your assessment of Rav Moshe's Baal Tosif concern and whether it would be analogous to Israeli Independence Day, to Yom HaAtzmaut.
So Rabbi Henkin is the halachic authority who delves most deeply into the Baal Tosef issue.
We're talking about Rav Yosef Eliyahu Henkin?
No, the Bnei Banim.
Oh, okay.
Rabbi Yehuda Herzl Henkin.
Okay,
His
his grandson.
tshuva stops and focuses on this issue. Rabbi Henkin is, of course, a fascinating figure because he is a Talmud of Rav Moshe intellectually, but an integrationist like the Rav culturally. He is the single most eminent halachic authority who went to Columbia College. When Columbia opens a Hall of Fame of great Torah scholars, um, he's not the only portrait on the wall, but he's the greatest portrait, for sure. And his point is that tshuva of Rav Moshe substantially retracts in the next tshuva. And that's the point of Rabbi Tendler's follow-up tshuva, which is Rabbi Tendler's follow-up tshuva says, excuse me, These tshuvos are not fully intellectually consistent.
Hmm.
And Rav Moshe responds by saying, "You're correct. That tshuva was a chumrah that I like, but it's not the din, and this is the din." And Rabbi Henkin points this out, um, and I think that that is the logically correct answer. That's why those two tshuvas, if Rav Moshe had not published the last tshuva harmonizing, we would not have known how to resolve this tension. But Rav Moshe resolves the tension.
Absolutely. So are you able to hear me still?
Yes.
Okay, great. So that's interesting. And so you also mentioned that you wrote a question to Rabbi Ephraim Greenblatt, who was one of the most prominent students of Rav Moshe Feinstein. So can you just tell us what was your finding in that? Does he kind of just follow Rav Moshe? And when we say follow Rav Moshe, like you pointed out, Rav Moshe seems to be inconsistent between his chuvos, and I'm curious what Rav Greenblatt's take on it was.
Rabbi Greenblatt's view is that celebrating Thanksgiving is a good thing, and that that was what he thought Rav Moshe really meant.
Hmm.
Um, and that is consistent with the final tshuva to Rabbi Mordechai Tendler as well. And let me add that Rabbi Greenblatt, by dint of the fact that he spent 40 years in the South, lived in a different part of the country
Oh yeah.
than Rav Moshe, a much more patriotic part of the country that took these things more seriously. And if I had to write down on a piece of paper the 20 chuvot of Rabbi Greenblatt that he would not have written had he lived in the Lower East Side,
Hmm.
this is one of them. There are a few of them. Rabbi Greenblatt, if you'll excuse me, was an Ish Memphis. In a real way, it entered his soul that the Memphis Southern style of living was morally better.
Hmm.
Rav Nata Greenblatt was less sure that this was the case, but Rav Ephraim was an Ish Memphis,
Yeah.
and he believed that that model was better for Jews and better for the country. And thus, he was affirmatively in favor of Jews being patriotic.
Hmm.
Um,
Was he also like a Johnny Cash, Fleetwood Mac fan? Do we know if that's true?
I never asked him, but there are a few tshuvas where you see in Rabbi Greenblatt um, the soul of a Southerner.
Hmm.
Um, he is the only Southern posek.
Interesting.
Now,
The only Southern posting. Wow.
Rav Nata, if you'll excuse me, I'll say this: the Mechilas Kavod Rav Ephraim. Rav Nata was a bigger Talmud Chacham.
Wow.
Sheer brain power. Rav Nata had. Rav Nata was magic.
Really?
His sheer brain power, his ideas were awe-inspiringly scary. But Rav Nata remained a New Yorker his whole life, even though he lived in Memphis.
How so? Like, how do you see that?
He traveled everywhere.
Like, did
Um,
Gittin? Yeah.
he did getting everywhere, and he interacted with the OU, and he would fly to New York. He was the first 2 million miler on Delta Airlines. No, and they wrote him a letter
Are you
introduced to
serious?
his biography. Yes,
That's
um,
remarkable.
and he lived in Memphis, but he was no Southerner in orientation.
Hmm.
He didn't believe in Southern virtuosos. Rav Ephraim was the Memphisite,
Interesting.
and he believed in patriotic gestures in ways that New Yorkers think they're kind of silly, and Southerners think they're kind of real.
Interesting. Well, it's funny. you're in the Philly area, and I'm in Allentown, and people think like I'm in the middle of the cornfields where there's like Confederate flags everywhere, and I said, no, I'm actually we have a city over here, and there aren't Confederate flags. There's rainbow flags, more rainbow
Well,
flags than Confederate flags where I live.
one of the
Um,
transitions from more than 30 years in Atlanta to now going back and forth between Philadelphia and Atlanta is Southerners are more sincerely patriotic and less cynical. And they actually believe in something called the United States of America.
right. So this was I was at a conference recently, and people were talking about, oh, when we send our kids to Israel, they learn how, materialism is not all that important, and they learn like the idea of caring for like the broader collective. And I raised my hand. I said, look, I'm not a Southerner or anything, but I bet you this isn't like an Israel versus America thing. This is a Northeast liberal elitist part of the America versus the middle heartland of America in the South. You would find the very same distinction. You don't need to go to Israel for that.
It's for sure true that Southern Jewry is more patriotic because Southern culture is more patriotic, and Rav Ephraim Greenblatt was part of that. Rabbi Henkin was part of it for a different reason, which is he was the most Israeli
Yeah.
of them, and Israelis are by their nature sympathetic to arguments of patriotism and virtue, and thus he put his Israeli imprimatur on an American
Well,
holiday.
I mean, I don't want to get too off the rails because this will get us a whole discussion about Zionism. But just anecdotally, there are some people you meet who espouse kind of a national conservative approach to politics. So say, yeah, we want, we can have our own Jewish ethno state, and the white Protestant Christians can have their ethno state. But the other approach I've seen in the Zionist circles is no, the only ethno state that matters is the chosen land, and we don't care about other people having their own ethno state and patriotism. That doesn't mean anything. So I've seen both anecdotally,
Okay,
but I want to return back to the Baltosif point, if that's okay.
sure.
So what's your assessment of the Baltosif argument, and to my member's question, to Marcia's question about does it extend to Baltosif? What's your personal assessment of the topic?
I think it doesn't apply at all to Thanksgiving, which doesn't have any ritual component at all and doesn't have tefillot,
Hmm.
and so on and so forth. If you're a religious Zionist in your core and you see the miracles, then you countervene the Baltosif argument with Chaye Adam's assertion that miracles need to be marked.
Hmm.
Um, the non-miraculous Zionists get caught in the Baltosif argument because there's nothing to note, and then there's a Baltosif problem. But if you believe that the reestablishment of the state of Israel was miraculous and the miracles were apparent, then you can easily resolve the Baltosif problem by saying, as the Chaye Adam does, that Nisim and Niflot need to be marked.
Right.
That's how the Chaye Adam responds to this problem, and he's not unique. The
Hmm.
idea that we would celebrate a miracle is not a Baltosif problem.
Right. And I'm not going to force you, but you're not going to tell us your view on the issue, are you?
I don't see a reason to bring me
Okay.
back to Yom
It's okay.
HaAtzmaut
It's okay. We don't
rather
need to
than
get you in
on
any trouble. It's
Thanksgiving.
fine.
Thanksgiving is not a miraculous holiday, and
Well,
there's little to no ritual.
well, this actually brings us, I think, to the final tshuva of Rav Moshe, which that's the part where I got really excited. Not that necessarily I was compelled by the argument, but I thought it was a fascinating argument. He basically quotes the Ramah, who says that whenever the standard reading of the Ramah is that when you see a ritual that has no obvious reason for it, we suspect that it comes from pagan roots. That's the standard understanding. And then Ramosha comes and says, no, 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 no. It's that any ritual that doesn't have a justifiable basis is Darchei Hamori. That's what pagans do. They make up rituals with no good reason. So he says, look, if they didn't have turkey, they'd eat something else. If they eat something else and they died, new people would have come with proper rations. And in the long term, we would still have America anyway. So who cares? Why do we need to celebrate this turkey? That's I got a kick out of
Okay,
that one.
okay. I don't find it so dispositive because patriotic symbols are definitionally
Symbolic.
symbolic.
Yeah,
That's right.
exactly.
That's
No,
correct.
likewise. I actually was just more excited for the lumdus of redefining what Darchi Hamori is than the actual application of the argument. That's where I got
Okay.
excited. But okay, but other than kind of shifting away from Rav Moshe a little bit, Rav Moshe brings up the Chukasakim concern, the emulating the ways of non-Jews. He brings up the Baal Tosef concern, adding on new holidays. Are there other considerations that other posts can bring up?
Sure. The big weighted argument that has some virtue to it is Rav Hutner's basic claim,
Hmm.
which is the dating things by the secular calendar is paradigmatically Chukos Hagoyim, and the secular calendar is it is paradigmatically Chukos Hagoyim.
So what's he do with
Now,
Saint Talamatar?
no, I don't think Vishain Talamatar bothers because it's counted from a certain number of days from an astronomical phenomena. But I think that Rabbi Hutner's basic point, which is saying this is the year 2025, and using today is November 19th, is a Chukas Hagoyim problem. I have always thought that Rav Hutner could be right, but he isn't in fact.
Hmm.
And
Okay.
that this is why Rav Moshe is tshuva about January 1st is so important. The
Mm.
fact that something comes from a pagan origin historically is a data point that creates a presumption of Isur. But that presumption of Isur is overcome by a sociology in which the prohibited origins have been supplanted by the reality. If at the end of the year 2025, every time we wrote 2025, we wrote Adodonius, or the year of our Lord,
Hmm.
I would be more inclined to think that Rabbi Hutner is correct. But I think that Rav Hutner is reflecting his Eastern European Christian origins, and that
Mm.
Rav Moshe has always understood the sociology of America better. You stop the typical non-Jew in America, say it's the year 2025 from what? And he says, I don't know and I don't care.
Really? People don't know?
And when you say to him, don't you know that the months are named after Babylonian pagan gods?
Yeah.
They say, what are you talking about? And when you say, don't you know that the names are God names from a different era? They say, what are you talking about?
Right.
And Rav Hutner could be correct. And maybe even in Poland, he was correct. And maybe there are even parts of the world where the dating system is called the Christian dating system rather than the secular dating system. But
Hmm.
here's the truth. Even in Israel, they use the secular dating system.
Well, I mean, even in Israel, if the Israeli government does something, is that dispositive for
No, but
halachic
it's
practice?
cultural. No, but it's cultural even among the Orthodox. Rav
Mm.
Nebenzahl writes that when somebody says, I'll do this today,
Hmm.
they don't mean at sunset when the halachic day ends.
Interesting. I never thought of that
Okay?
being an issue, potentially.
It means the secular day because essentially Rav Nebenzahl writes that even in Israel, the dating system that predominates is secular,
Hmm.
not religious. When I say to you, I am borrowing $1,000 and I will repay it today in
Hmm.
a year, what do I mean?
Right. So that's where we have to use
Oh,
principles of umdana, where we have to make assumptions of what people
so
actually
Rabbi
mean.
Nevinsall says that even if I'm standing in the Cotel Plaza, I mean November 19th,
Mm,
2025, and the loan is due November 19th, 2026. And when
mm.
I say to Rav Nevinsall, my gosh, why doesn't it use the Torah calendar? Rav Nevinsall says, I'm not telling you good or bad. I'm just describing to you how even the Orthodox in Yerushalayim do this. A bank loan until the end of the year doesn't mean the last day of Elul. It means December 31st. So I think that Rav Hutner could be correct,
Yeah.
but he
Now,
isn't.
okay, so good. So this actually brings me to one of the questions I wanted to ask you about. And I think when I read your paper on the topic, tell me if I'm wrong. The topic of not Thanksgiving, but Halloween, which
Yes.
we know has pagan origins, but couldn't someone make a similar argument that if you stop random trick-or-treaters on the street and ask them about, oh, why are you doing Halloween? They're just going to be like, we just dress up and have fun once a year. That's it. We
I
get
agree
candy.
with that argument abstractly. I think that Halloween suffers from the problem of nonsense, and it's a vice, and thus I'm against it. But I think, in truth, the technical Chukas Hagayim problem, which is it comes from an Irish pagan holiday, then becomes Catholic. In America, as that origin is something that the encyclopedia nerds know, but the kids on the street that go trick or treating do not.
Mm.
And the proof, by the way, and I note this in the book, is the dominant costumes in the 50s are ghosts and goblins, and they're now Donalds and Baracks. And when they're not Donalds and Baracks, they're Batman and Spider Man and Wonder Woman. The transition from um, a religion to a cartoon character is
Mm.
profound. Let me do halacha l'maisa for a minute. Every year, somebody calls me up and says, Rabbi Broyde, can my child go out Purim time dressed like Hercules? And I say, yes. Hercules, who used to be a demigod
Yep.
and who used to be part of Greek mythology, is now a superhero,
It's a Disney movie.
is a Disney movie. So when I
It's
show
a
you
great
a
movie, by the
statue
way.
of Hercules and I say to you, we have two rooms here. One has Moses, Jesus, and Mohammed, and one has Batman, Superman, and Spider Man. Where does the statue of Hercules go?
Ah. With the rest of the Disney characters.
So I think it goes next to Batman and Superman and Spider Man. And he doesn't go next to Moses and Mohammed and other religious figures. A transition has occurred from Hercules being a half god deity to being a character in a Disney movie or on Xena the Warrior Princess. And that this is a complicated social transition. You know, I'm not even sure about Santa.
It started with the
I'll
Coca-Cola, right?
I'll tell you why. Walt Disney has a rule. No Disney cartoons have religious figures in it.
Ah.
And yet Santa appears on Mickey Mouse's Clubhouse.
Now
Um,
that's a mucker for a source sheet, right?
it is because Disney thinks that Santa is not governed by their no religious figures. Moses does not appear, and they won't make movies with Christian figures or Islamic figures or Jewish figures. And Santa um, plays with Mickey Mouse. The
Mm.
transition from a religious figure to a social figure to a cartoon figure is not a single moment. Um,
And what do you think
But
that
yet
says
it,
about our society now?
okay. A few years ago, one of my congregants was working in Best Buy. He's a poor Jew with a job that provided health insurance. No, really. And everybody in the month of December put on a Santa hat. And the store asked him if he would. And he asked me if he could. And I asked one of my rebbeim, and I said, poor Jew's worried about losing his job. Can he put on a Santa hat? And one of my rebbeim said yes.
It's like the chuvas about can you take off your yarmulke in the workforce?
I just meaning Santa hat is not a crucifix.
Right.
It's a Santa hat, and maybe in America, Santa hats are more distant from Christianity
Right.
than they were in a different era. You opened by talking about the secularization of Christmas, and this is an example of this. You cannot look at religious holidays in a vacuum. In the next edition of the Thanksgiving book that's going to come out next year, I've gotten a lot of feedback, and there's a second edition. There's going to be an appendix about the Russian holiday which has made
Yes.
it to Israel called Novi God. Novi God is a communist holiday that was a Christmas substitute,
Yes,
but it
a a
it
member of
comes
yeah.
It comes from the communist authorities synchronistically adopting Christian rituals and making them secular.
Mm,
So that's a hard question. When a religion loses its Christian character but keeps its Christian icons, that's a hard question.
right.
This comes up, by the way, in Japan, where none of them are Christians, but they do gift giving Christmas time as a throwback to when Japan had just been destroyed by America. The GIs came in and occupied it, and the GIs started the Japanese tradition of Christmas presents, which took hold in Japan. So there are no GIs left with Christmas presents, but the Japanese remember the GIs by giving Christmas presents in a Shinto society where there are no Christians. So in
Mm,
Japan, I'm not a Christian and you're not a Christian, and we
hmm.
both firmly are Shintoists, and yet we give out Christmas gifts. It's
Right.
hard to figure this one out.
Right. So, going back to the Halloween point, I think I kind of espouse a similar approach to these kind of questions that you have, and you've clearly done a lot more research into this whole Chukas Akum issue more broadly. So I'm gratified to hear that Baruch Shekivanti. Whenever I see Rabbanim, particularly in the modern Orthodox community, who speak out against their congregants going trick or treating, my take is as follows. I'm less bothered about people going trick or treating in the evening. I'm more bothered about did they show up to Mincha and Ma'ariv at shul beforehand. I actually want to give a heter, which is if you actually show up to Mincha Ma'ariv during the week, then you could go ahead and trick or treat afterwards. That to me
And
is like the bigger threat is are people showing
okay,
up to Minyan during the week? Then are they going trick or treating? That's what bothers
well,
me more personally.
I'm hostile to trick or treating because the virtue that undergirds it, which is the implied threat of vandalization, if you don't give me the trick
Uh,
or the treat, goes against the Jewish midot.
mhm.
And thus, I'm not comfortable with trick or treating because um, the trick part
Mm,
strikes me as a midah ra.
right, it's a threat. Yeah, that
It's a
doesn't
threat.
sound too
So I
nice.
don't like Halloween for that reason, independent of a moment's worth of chukas ha'akum. But I have a confession to make. At Emory University, where I teach, Halloween time they leave out chocolate, and I've occasionally walked by on my way to class, and if the bowl of chocolate is out and it's one of the brands that are kosher, it's not beyond the pale that I succumb to the more serious Torah vice of eating too much, and I'll take a chocolate. And when you say to me, isn't the chocolate a commemoration of Halloween? I say, look, um, I'm not in costume, and the chocolate is kosher. And the connection between trick or treating and eating when you're not in costume is too distant for me.
Hmm.
And I might even feel the same way in truth around Christmas time when they put out my single favorite candy in the whole world called M&Ms,
Mm.
and they're green and red. I might
Yes.
take a green and red M&M, even though when you ask me, aren't those Christmas colors? I say, but it's a very distant way
Yeah.
of marking the holiday.
Absolutely.
What I wish for on Thanksgiving is complicated because I really think that Orthodoxy needs to double down on patriotism. In this anti-Semitic era, where we can't figure out the dispute in our community is whether the left or the right are more anti-Semitic. We're not sure. We need to share with our community the need to be good Americans.
What does that look like?
I think it means that we have a Thanksgiving meal and we use the meal to talk about the good and the bad in America and the need to be supportive citizens of the Republic, helping it push its virtues and helping it suppress its vices. It's not that we think everything is perfect. But Thanksgiving is an opportunity for people around the table to talk about what made America great for Jews and what we need to do to double down on the virtue and move away from the vices.
I'm
And
I'm
that's an
yeah.
important thing.
Right, so I'm very supportive of it, and I mean this could be a whole other podcast episode. Maybe it's not even meant for the Shalos of Chuvas podcast, but I'm very sympathetic to that argument that we should be very proudly patriotic. Something I'm proud we did at our shul recently for Veterans Day was we called up our veterans. We said a special prayer for those who serve, those who are currently serving in the United States military. And then on Veterans Day, I had the privilege of reciting a prayer at the city center, town hall, when I did the flag raising with the mayor and everybody who was there. And I think I haven't checked historical records, but I think I was the first person at Allentown City Hall to invoke the name of Moshe Feinstein. I opened up by saying how the greatest rabbi of the 20th century described America as Medinas HaChesed, as a country of loving kindness. But I think the challenge is that since many of us, one can argue, rightly are very much looking for the interests of Eretz Yisrael. I mean, you see on the right and the left, people say, well, why are we sending our children overseas to fight in a foreign military rather than to fight in the United States military? Why is it that we're constantly trying to get funding for a foreign country? So, I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. Like, I think that certainly we should be giving back and we should be demonstrating patriotism, but I think going beyond just hollow symbolism of having a Thanksgiving meal, I don't know if that's going to cut it for all the
I don't think
anti-Semitism
it
we're
should
seeing
be a
today.
hollow symbolism of a Thanksgiving meal. I think the Thanksgiving meal is the ritual basis for having a conversation around the table
Hmm,
about what's good in America.
interesting.
It's a moment for having a conversation about what's good in America and what we can make better and what evils do we need to eradicate. These are important conversations. And the best time to have important conversations is over food,
Ah,
when people are in a
nothing.
good
And
mood.
and if you're going to make a Chukas Akim argument, there's nothing more Jewish than that.
But I think that it's just we're at an important inflection moment.
Hmm.
I would never advance an argument that's good for America, good for Israel, and bad for America.
Hmm.
I don't think we should do so quickly. It needs to be, in the formulation of APAC, good for both. It
Well,
can be
only
bad for
because,
China and
well, because
bad for
you
Russia.
because you
But
bring it up, and again, I'm going to regret going a little bit off the tracks of our Chuva discussion. I once had the privilege of doing an APAC program. They were very wonderful to us. It was very educational. We had one of the top honchos in the room. I forgot if it was a CEO or president at the time. Gave us 20 minutes for a quick Q&A. So I asked the question. I think cultivating American joint American-Israeli interests is a great idea, and I want to see our interests align. But let me just ask, if there's a policy that benefits one and not the other, which one are you going to give priority to, America or Israel? And you know what he said? Such a thing can never happen.
I agree with him. I agree with him. And I think when it does happen, it has to be on small, trivial
Right.
things where husbands and wives don't always agree on how much tahina to add to their hummus, and yet they stay happily married.
Inter-
But you
Well,
can't get,
Halavai, it stays that way. But
but
but I mean, let me just bring things back in. So back to our tshuva discussion. We're in the home stretch over here. Is there anything else about the chuvos that you have interacted with? Is there anything like that you learned from being part of the process of being a shoel in a tshuva? Is there anything else about your analysis of Thanksgiving or that's in your new book that you have that you would like our audience and myself to be aware of before we conclude tonight?
well, I'll say a big picture. Learning to ask questions develops the halachic literature.
Hmm.
And that's a very important idea. Learning to ask questions moves along the halachic process. And Ein Habaishan Lama, you don't learn by being quiet, is not only true personally. Torah is advanced in America by asking questions about how to be a Torah Jew in America. And I'm glad I invested in the Thanksgiving literature in the 90s, and I'm glad I invested in it again. I'm only a Thanksgiving rabbi for 2 weeks in November. Most people, when they think about me, they think I'm a hair covering rabbi. I'm much more famous for my material on Sniut than my material on Thanksgiving. And some people would say I'm not even famous about it. I'm infamous. But but that's neither here nor there. Thanksgiving comes up every once in a while, but figuring out how to be a good American
Hmm.
and a religious Jew is a central and important question. The questions were different in the 50s than they were in the 90s, and the questions are changing again as there's much more robust anti-Semitism on the left and the right in the 20s than there was in the 10s or the 90s. We're going back to a more serious purpose of Judaism because we are returning to the anti-Semitism of a century ago.
Hmm.
And I hope that the community uses it as an opportunity to double down on the serious good things of being an Orthodox Jew in America are.
Absolutely. We should take Thanksgiving seriously and basically take advantage of the opportunity that it could really be for everyone. Rabbi Broyde,
Amen.
I really appreciate you coming on the podcast, sharing your expertise with us, and maybe we'll have to do the head covering one in a future episode. Thank you so much, and wishing you a Freilichen Thanksgiving.
Thank you. You also.